There was a time when I mocked Christians who prayed with oil. I didn't fear the oil itself. I feared what it represented. You need to understand something before we go any further. When I was deep in the occult, we were not afraid of household objects. We were not afraid of symbols. We were not afraid of rituals. We were afraid of authority. And oil, when used correctly, represents authority. Not magic, not superstition, not some mystical liquid with secret chemical power. Authority, I've heard people say, when you anoint your home with oil, demons start screaming. Let me be honest with you. Oil by itself does nothing. It is not a weapon. It is not a charm. It is not a spell. But when a believer understands what they are doing, when they pray with conviction, when they stand in faith, when they understand covenant, that is when the atmosphere shifts. And that's what I'm going to explain today. Because too many Christians are using oil like a lucky charm. And too many others are afraid of it because they've been told dramatic stories without biblical foundation. When I left the occult, one of the biggest lies I had to unlearn was this, that power is in objects. Power is never in the object. Power is in alignment. Tonight I'm going to explain what really happens when you pray with oil, what it means spiritually, what it does not mean, and why the enemy doesn't fear the oil, but fears the believer who understands it. Stay with me. Because by the end of this message, you're going to stop acting out of fear and start acting out of confidence. Let me take you back to something most believers were never taught. In the occult, we used objects constantly: candles, powders, rings, symbols. But here's the secret. None of those objects had power on their own. They were simply physical points of agreement. Agreement is what activates spiritual authority. When Christians anoint with oil, many don't realize they are participating in something ancient and biblical. In Scripture, oil was used to consecrate kings, priests, and sacred spaces. It marked something as set apart. It symbolized the Holy Spirit. It represented dedication to God's authority, but it was always symbolic. The oil didn't make David king. God did. The oil didn't make the temple holy. God's presence did. The oil didn't heal the sick. God's power did. And this is where superstition creeps in. Superstition says, if I apply this correctly, I force a spiritual result. Faith says, I align myself with what God has already promised. Those are two completely different mindsets. When I was in darkness, we actually loved when people treated sacred things like charms. Why? Because charms replace relationship. Ritual replaces obedience. And fear replaces faith. If someone thinks oil is magic, they are already misunderstanding authority. But when someone prays with oil and understands, this is an outward sign of inward trust. Something shifts inside them. Not because of chemistry, not because of mysticism, but because of alignment. Oil is a declaration. It says, This home belongs to God. It says, this body is set apart. It says, this situation is surrendered. And surrender terrifies darkness more than drama ever could. I've seen people whisper over a bottle of oil as if they were charging it with power. That is not biblical. Oil is not charged. Oil is not enchanted. Oil is not infused with secret frequency. It is simply oil. But when a believer touches a doorpost and prays with conviction, something happens internally. Fear breaks, confidence rises, faith activates. And that internal shift changes how they stand, how they speak, and how they respond. And authority flows through alignment. That's what we feared in the occult, not objects, but aligned believers. Because a confident believer who understands covenant cannot be manipulated by fear tactics. So if you've ever prayed with oil and wondered, is this doing anything? Here's the truth. It's not about what the oil is doing. It's about what you are declaring. And in the next chapter, I'm going to explain why intention without understanding can create confusion, and how to use this practice without falling into fear-based thinking. There is something I need to say clearly, because this is where many believers unknowingly drift into confusion. When I was in the occult, we studied focus. Not just rituals, focus. We understood that whatever a person fixates on emotionally, they empower psychologically. Fear sharpens focus. Anxiety feeds imagination, and imagination, when unchecked, can build entire spiritual narratives that feel real. So when Christians begin to obsess over, what did I do wrong? Or, did I apply the oil correctly? Or, did I say the prayer the right way? The focus subtly shifts. It shifts from God's authority to personal performance. And that is dangerous ground, because the moment faith becomes a formula, peace disappears. In darkness, we thrived on that confusion. If someone believed protection depended on perfect execution, they would live in constant anxiety. They would redo prayers, reapply oil, repeat phrases, not out of trust, but out of fear of missing a step. And fear is exhausting. Let me be very clear. God is not waiting for you to perform a ritual flawlessly before He protects you. He is not grading your pronunciation. He is not measuring the thickness of oil on your forehead. Protection does not come from precision. It comes from relationship. When oil becomes the focus, faith becomes secondary. And when faith becomes secondary, peace disappears. There were times I watched people anoint every window, every door, every object in their home, but still walk around terrified, not because darkness was overpowering them, but because their imagination was. Fear magnifies shadows. Confidence shrinks them. When someone prays with oil and then lies awake analyzing every noise in the house, that's not spiritual attack. That's hyper-awareness fueled by anxiety. And anxiety can mimic spiritual warfare. This is why understanding matters. Oil is a symbol of dedication. Prayer is communication. Faith is trust. None of those are meant to create paranoia. They are meant to create peace. If your spiritual practice increases fear, something is misaligned. Because true authority produces calm. When I left the occult, one of the first things that shocked me was how peaceful real faith felt. No frantic rituals, no constant checking, no anxiety about hidden forces lurking behind every inconvenience. Peace is a sign of alignment. Darkness does not tremble because someone used oil. Darkness retreats when someone stands in confident, settled authority without fear. And here's something most won't tell you. Many experiences people interpret as spiritual interference are often stress, lack of sleep, overexposure to intense content, or suggestion. When your mind is saturated with warnings about hidden forces, your brain will search for patterns. That's how humans are wired. So before assuming every creak is a presence or every bad dream is an attack, breathe. Ground yourself. Ask, am I at peace? Because authority does not feel frantic, it feels steady. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what real spiritual maturity looks like and why maturity is far more powerful than dramatic rituals. When I was deep in occult practice, I expected spiritual power to feel dramatic. Candles, symbols, spoken incantations, complex gestures, layers of secrecy. Everything was theatrical. Everything was intense. Everything was meant to look powerful. But here is what shocked me after I left. Real spiritual authority is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't panic. It doesn't perform. It stands. When someone truly understands who they are in God, there is no desperation in their voice, no frantic repetition, no obsession over techniques. There is calm certainty, and that calm certainty is something darkness cannot manipulate. In the occult, we depended heavily on emotional volatility. Fearful people were easier to disturb. Anxious people were easier to influence. Superstitious people were easier to intimidate. But a grounded believer, one who trusts without dramatics, very difficult to shake. Authority does not come from how loud you pray. It does not come from how much oil you use. It does not come from how many spiritual steps you follow. It comes from alignment and confidence. Let me explain something important. When someone believes protection depends on constant spiritual activity, they unknowingly place themselves in a cycle of maintenance. They feel they must always be doing something to hold off darkness. That mindset creates exhaustion. True authority does not feel like maintenance. It feels like ownership. Think about a homeowner. They don't walk around their house every hour checking if they still own it. They know they own it. That confidence changes how they move inside it. Spiritual maturity works the same way. If you believe you must constantly defend yourself from hidden attacks, your nervous system stays in survival mode, and survival mode distorts perception. You start interpreting ordinary stress as warfare. You start seeing symbolism in coincidence. You start attributing every inconvenience to an invisible enemy. That's not authority, that's hypervigilance. And hypervigilance drains peace. When I stepped away from occult structures, I realized something profound. The people we struggled to influence were not the loudest believers. They were the most settled ones, the ones who slept peacefully, the ones who prayed simply, the ones who didn't obsess over hidden meanings. They weren't trying to fight every shadow. They weren't looking for enemies behind every door. They lived steady, and steadiness is powerful. If you pray with oil, do it with calm. If you speak a blessing, speak it with trust. If you dedicate your home, do it once with confidence, not repeatedly out of fear. Repetition born from fear weakens peace. Consistency born from faith strengthens it. There is a huge difference. You do not need to dramatize your protection. You do not need to turn every night into a battlefield. You do not need to imagine forces lurking at every corner. What you need is clarity. Clarity produces confidence. Confidence produces calm. Calm produces authority. And authority, real authority, does not tremble at shadows. In the next chapter, we'll talk about how to protect your peace in practical ways, not through fear-based rituals, but through balanced, grounded spiritual discipline that strengthens your mind and your faith. Let me tell you what we actually feared the most when I was still involved in occult practices. It wasn't loud prayer. It wasn't dramatic declarations. It wasn't people shouting at darkness. It was people who were mentally and spiritually stable. Because stability is extremely difficult to penetrate. When someone's life is chaotic, when their thoughts are scattered, when they are constantly afraid something unseen is targeting them, that instability creates openings, not mystical portals, emotional ones, psychological ones, stress fractures in the mind, and stress is powerful. Stress amplifies normal experiences and makes them feel supernatural. A random noise becomes a sign, a bad dream becomes an attack, a normal financial setback becomes a curse. But a peaceful mind filters reality correctly. That's why protecting your peace is not passive, it's strategic. Here's what that actually looks like in real life. First, regulate your input. If you constantly consume content about hidden enemies, secret attacks, coded messages, and spiritual ambushes, your brain adapts to scan for threats. It becomes hyper alert, and hyper alert minds don't rest well. Darkness does not need to attack a mind that is already exhausted. Guard what you allow into your thoughts. Second, simplify your spiritual habits. You do not need 15 nightly rituals. You do not need complicated sequences. You do not need to fear missing a step. Choose a simple prayer. Speak it sincerely. Release the night to God, then sleep. Peaceful sleep is not weakness, it is trust, and trust is extremely powerful. Third, strengthen your physical life. This may surprise you, but many of the spiritual disturbances people describe are rooted in physical neglect. Sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, dehydration, and constant screen exposure can create anxiety, brain fog, and vivid dreams. When the body is unstable, the mind becomes suggestible. Occult systems often blurred the line between physical symptoms and spiritual interpretation. That confusion kept people dependent and afraid. Clarity breaks that cycle. Drink water, sleep properly, limit stimulation before bed, step outside during the day, move your body. These are not small things. They stabilize your nervous system, and a regulated nervous system is harder to frighten. Fourth, practice gratitude deliberately. Gratitude rewires focus. It shifts your awareness from what might attack me to what is already good around me. Fear narrows perception, gratitude expands it, and expanded perception weakens paranoia. Let me say something clearly. Not every setback is spiritual. Not every coincidence is symbolic. Not every discomfort is an attack. Sometimes it is life. Sometimes it is stress. Sometimes it is exhaustion. Maturity means discerning the difference. The strongest believers I've met after leaving that world were not the ones obsessed with warfare language. They were the ones who walked in steady joy. They were grounded, balanced, calm. They did not live in reaction mode. They lived in alignment. And alignment produces a quiet authority that doesn't need to constantly prove itself. If you want to protect your home, bless it once with sincerity. Then live peacefully inside it. If you want to protect your sleep, pray once with trust. Then rest. If you want to protect your mind, stop feeding it constant narratives of hidden danger. Darkness feeds on exaggeration. Peace starves it. And when you consistently choose peace, mentally, spiritually, physically, you build something stronger than fear-driven rituals. You build resilience. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how to recognize when fear has been masquerading as spirituality and how to step out of that cycle permanently without losing your faith.